And also we have ma'am our Assistant Dean of the ICFI Law School, ma'am, Mrs. Monica Karula, ma'am.
Hello, good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us, ma'am. It's wonderful to see you here, and it will be great for our students. Thank you.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you.
Anushka ma'am, we should begin in 1 minute with the permission of the chief guest.
Sure, sir.
Anushka ma'am, we can begin, ma'am. With the permission, please begin.
Ma'am, may we please start?
I may start.
I'll just start. Okay. A very good afternoon to everyone. I am Anushmi Jain, Faculty of Law, the ICFI University, Dehradun. I welcome you all to the International Workshop on Environmental Justice and Climate Change, SDG Goals 2021, organized by Center for Environmental Law, Policy, Education and Development, also known as CELPED, ICFI Law School, the ICFI University, Dehradun, in association with United Nations Environment Programme. I would like to take the privilege to extend a heartwarming welcome to our speaker for the day, Ms. Patricia Kameri, Director of Law Division, United Nations Environmental Programme. Thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and gracing the event with your valuable presence. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Brigadier Rajiv Sethi, Registrar, the ICFI University, Dehradun, Mrs. Monica Karola, Assistant Dean, ICFI Law School, and all the participants who have joined us today. Moving forward, now I would request Brigadier Rajiv Sethi, Registrar, the ICFI University, Dehradun, to deliver a brief introduction to the event. Please, sir.
Okay, thank you, Anushmi. And am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Firstly, our grateful thanks to Ms. Patricia to have accepted the invitation of ICFI University, Dehradun to speak to the students and the other participants on the various aspects which relate to this particular topic. Once I was told that there is going to be some conversation regarding the environmental justice, it's actually piqued my interest in the subject, and I started reading a little bit about it. I realized, or what I have understood of it, is that it is the disadvantaged class who should have a say in whatever the environmental damages that could be caused to the environment or to the climate, and people should have enough say while enacting any of the laws. And I started reading on a particular case in India that related to the sterlite industries, which had caused a great amount of environmental damage, and how the permissions were given. So without much ado, since I don't have much of a knowledge on the subject, I would like to revert back to Anushmi and say that I'll request you to take the matter forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Now I would request Mrs. Monica Karola, Assistant Dean, ICFI Law School, Dehradun, to enlighten us about the university and ICFI Law School. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, Anushmi. And firstly, it's my pleasure and an opportunity to welcome our guest today, Ms. Patricia Kameri. And we are very happy, and it's a great opportunity for ICFI Law School to be associated with UNEP and to take forward the issues and challenges in environment and environmental law. I would, for the benefit of our guest, like to inform that ICFI University, Dehradun started in the year 2003, and the ICFI Law School commenced from 2004. We have different law programs like BA LLB, BBA LLB, LLB, LLM, and PhD. And we have been trying to inculcate in our students good learning values and trying to adopt the latest pedagogy in order to make the learning and teaching process more effective and fruitful. We have also started several centers of excellence, and these centers, like the one which has today organized this event, the Center for Environment, we try to ensure that there is research and there is more in-depth learning in these subjects, because they are highly important and need to be explored in order to make the environment, the cyber security, or human rights stronger. So these centers act as research centers. They help in generating awareness, in creating some kind of competition between students for different activities, which will help in sensitization to these subjects. And it is fruitful, and we have seen that the guest lectures that we have in the past we have organized have been very beneficial for the students, not only in ICFI but all over India. And we are very happy to get Miss Patricia today. Center of Environment has been very effective. It has organized a national moot court also on the environmental issue. And today we know that environment is one of the most important issue. And internationally also, if we see that the conferences that we are having are also indicator that environment is very crucial in order to secure our future. With these, I would like to give the mic back to Anushmi and thank the guest for being with us once again. Thank you, ma'am, for giving your time and helping us to know about the environmental issues and challenges. And thank you for being here. Over to you, Anushmi.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Now I would request Mr. Vishal Bera, Faculty Convener, ICFI Law School, to introduce our speaker for the day. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am. To introduce the speaker of the day, Ms. Patricia Ma'am is the Director of the Law Division of the United Nations Environment Program. Previously, Madam Patricia was Founding Research Director of the International Environmental Law Research Center and was the Program Director for Africa for over 20 years. Ma'am holds an in-depth knowledge and experience in environmental law acquired at local, national, regional, and international levels. She has consulted for United Nations Environment Program in the review of program, legal instruments, and the rules of engagement for various major groups. She has been engaged in the Montevideo Environmental Law Program since 2007 and is a member of the governing body of the International Council on Environmental Law. Madam Patricia is also a member of the Senior Council Bar in Kenya and has been a professor of law at the School of Law, University of Nairobi, where she has taught over 30 years and also has served as dean. She has also taught environmental law at Kenyatta University, University of Zimbabwe, and Stellenbosch University. She has also served as the chair of the Association of the Environmental Law Lecturers in African universities and has also contributed to the development of similar initiative for North Africa and Middle East and also for judges. Madam Patricia holds an honorable doctorate and master degree in law from Stanford University and a higher doctorate from the University of Nairobi. She also holds a master degree from Warwick University and was also awarded an honorary degree in law by the University of Oslo in 2017. With this, I request ma'am to please begin with the workshop today, ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the very warm introduction and also for giving me this opportunity. I have a previous life in the academy, and so I feel at home today because the School of Law has been my home for many years. So any faculty of law in the world, I feel at home in that faculty of law. But secondly, this I think is not my first interaction with ICFI. I have worked on a journal article for, I think it is a journal that you run, the Annals of Arid Lands. And this was looking at the MDGs. and how the MDGs affected women particularly. So I feel at home. Today, we have a very important matter to look into. And I think for law students, environmental justice is really at the core of what we do, because when we study law, justice is what we are seeking to do, and we want to deliver for everybody. And in essence, the title of my lecture is Environmental Justice and Climate Change, Strengthening Environmental Rule of Law for Climate Action. And by way of introduction, to say that environmental justice has been at the heart of climate governance from the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, and it continues to be there. I think the definition of environmental justice first came up in the US when people were talking about the unfair practices of locating dump sites in spaces where persons of color lived. But I think from those days to now, environmental justice has come of age, because we see a lot of interrelated climate problems that actually cause more grievous damage to parts of the world than to others. And with respect to climate change, it remains at the core of the greatest existential crisis of our time. And it is part of the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Sometimes we look at these things in isolation, but they're actually very, very connected. So whether you're talking of surface level impacts of extreme weather events, extended droughts and floods, increased incidences of forest fires and hurricanes, rising sea levels, melting ice caps, extinction of species, threats to livelihoods such as destruction of ecosystems and depletion of water sources, all these have justice connotations. Indeed, climate change affects every aspect of life for all people around the world, with disproportionate impacts on the most vulnerable. The most affected are also the least able to adapt, with climate change then being an impact amplifier within the context of inequalities and endowment of resources. Despite looking at climate change and seeing only the floods, the rising, the water levels rising, there are unseen and hidden impacts of climate change on our economies, our societies. They deepen inequalities. When we say it is an impact amplifier, it is also a threat amplifier. So you have marginalization of the most vulnerable, compounded health impacts. For instance, when COVID-19 hit the world, it didn't give notice, and it didn't tell climate change, step aside, I am coming in. So people were found with the impacts of climate change, and the COVID-19 then came in, and all this is being experienced in the same space. The unseen impacts point to environmental injustices, and these require a solution. We must have been following the climate change discussions in Glasgow, and just before them, the ones in Kunming on biodiversity. And both illustrate that we have come a long way in addressing the pressing challenges of our time. But of course, challenges still remain, even though we are working on dealing with them. I think one of the things that we celebrate is the fact that concepts such as climate change, global warming, nature laws, nature-based solutions, marine pollution, marine litter, and other lingua that were only common to people in the environment science field are now on the tongues of people from all walks of life. and also from different parts of the world. So you have children and young people asking us to recognize that they are the generation whose futures we place at risk with every passing day if we do not act. And while we might not have all the answers now, we do have some of the most important tools to shift the needle, not least of which is the environmental rule of law. And as students of law, rule of law is something that you're attuned to, which is actually the application of law to prevent the majority or the people who are more or more powerful loading it on those who are minorities and those who do not have power. So rule of law actually seeks to deal with abuse of power. And I think in the environmental rule of law area, what you're seeking to do is to ensure that the countries that are most affected and least able to adapt do not fall off. So at the heart of discussions on environmental justice and climate change are the efforts that different actors are making, such as states, individuals, communities, businesses, children, women, youth, indigenous people. They are all making efforts to deal with the problems, but we must remember that for some of these, especially the indigenous communities, people who've lived in close proximity to the environment, they've been dealing with these issues even before we started talking about the concept of sustainable development in international law. And when we then bring in a new concept such as environmental rule of law, sometimes we think that it is new, but it is just acquiring new flavors. And I'd like at this point also to refer us to the report that was released by the Secretary General of the United Nations not too long ago. He talked about our common agenda. And our common agenda really rings a bell to what many years ago in 1987, in the Bratland report, when they talked about our common future. And if you look at the context of our common agenda, they are talking about things that we lawyers talk about, such as the social contract. We always think that the social contract is between, is in nation states and between the states and the citizenry. But the fact that now social contract is being talked about at the international level calls upon us as law students to begin thinking about how to discuss this issue so that it makes sense to us, especially if we're students within different contexts, whether in India or Africa. The other point that the common agenda talks about is solidarity. And you know that in many communities in the global south, this solidarity is what actually keeps people together. And I know that in India, as in Africa, solidarity is really an important thing. So when you elevate concepts that come from the very local, go to the national, then they become international, it means that we are now beginning to come together in looking at ways of dealing with the existential challenges we face. So in these, what I'd like us to do here is to look at how states have made provisions at the international, regional, and national levels to address climate change. And the reason I brought in the solidarity and the social contract is so that we begin to understand that this is not a new thing. It is something that we as lawyers and as people who live, many of us, whether it's in urban areas or rural areas, the environmental problems are really not out there. They are actually part and parcel of our everyday lives. I'd like us to see how states have sought to address these problems that we have. And then we will examine some examples of the embodiment of environmental justice around the world, for instance, through climate litigation. And then we will cast our eye to the future and see what is the future that we want. And it's good that we're talking to university students, because, you know, my frustration as a person who works in the environment is that we are talking amongst ourselves, people who are old or older, and we are not getting the buy-in of the very many young people. I mean, working in different continents in the global south, you see that quite a lot of the people are the youth. So the future we want must really include the youth, because they are the ones who will be in that future and deal with it. So in this decade of action, we have less than 10 years to ensure that the dreams and aspirations of the global environmental community infuse concrete promises by the year 2030 and beyond. At the end, we'll conclude with 5 key areas that we consider to give future generations a fighting chance on this planet. And I am remiss because I didn't point out that in preparation of this work, I am putting my money where my mouth is by working with a person in the next generation, Alvin Gashie. And it is because it doesn't matter how well I talk about these things, if we don't have younger people talking about them, then the future is lost. So let us look back to where we are coming from, like the last 50 years. In the 70s, with the onset of the global economic slowdown, some newly formed states in developing regions were charting their way in the global arena and enjoying relatively robust growth. Older states that were involved in the creation of the League of Nations and its successor, the UN, faced weak growth, in high inflation, and high unemployment. Some states were not yet born. At this stage, while developed countries had in the most part been part of the international negotiations, developing countries were, and sadly, they still are, grappling with a myriad of local challenges, including lower capacities, which hinder their meaningful engagement at global levels. Negotiation on important international agreements, including the human rights conventions, happened and were concluded during these early years of the UN, where multilateralism was, of course, not very multilateral, and it had a dominance of certain actors. States had in the previous 10 years concluded international treaties that would form the basis of international human rights discussions. A crop of newly formed states in the previous 20 years was key in shaping the global worldview and distinctions between developed and developing nations, with the emergence of development of such classifications as developed, least developed, developing, becoming evident. A year prior, in 1971, states created the least developing countries category by a UN General Assembly resolution to support countries, now 46 in number and home to approximately 880 million people and 12% of the global population, to address severe structural barriers to growth and development. The international negotiations arena painted a picture, remnants of which, sadly, we still see today, which are inequality and injustice. And if you attend multilateral sessions, you will always hear the echoes of inequality, injustice, the quest for inclusivity. Today, we remind ourselves of the importance of multilateralism as states around the world challenge the very ideals set up in the Charter of the UN, where against the backdrop of the Second World War, we the peoples of the UN, determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. In 1972, we have a really critical milestone in economic, social, and political life. And this is the first time that we have this concept of sustainable development, which had not yet entered center stage, and the idea of intergenerational equity, the importance to live our lives now aware that there will be people who come after us and they will depend on the same resources that we live off right now. And this was carried on in the Brundtland Report and the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987, and was actually incorporated in large part in Agenda 21 at the Rio Conference on Environment and Development. And most recently, these are embedded also in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which yielded the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, what you see is increasingly an acceptance that development cannot go on at the expense of the environment. And when people talk about environmental sustainability, people talk about the three stools, that you must have environment, you must have the economy, yes, and you must have people, because at the end of the day, people are important. So it was recognized that to defend and improve the human environment for present and future generations must be an imperative goal of humankind, a goal to be pursued together and in harmony with established and fundamental goals of peace and worldwide economic and social development. Not only was the world called to consider economic, social, and political progress, but also to recognize the environmental aspects of human development. In this context, an important realization emerged that if human societies are to develop at the same rate and using the same finite economic and natural resources available, there is a need to check ourselves, or we are going to work ourselves to extinction. And if you listen to discussions at Kunming and even in Glasgow, this narrative of we may be working ourselves to extinction unless we check our consumption patterns. And of course, consumption patterns, that is it is a contentious point, because people will be saying you're telling people that they are over-consuming when we know that there are very many people in the global south who even getting one meal a day is a challenge. Similar narratives actually continue 50 years later in discussions on the triple planetary crisis. And if we continue using what is available to us from the natural world with the same mindsets of business as usual and without changing our paradigm, then there will be no natural world left for future generations. And we've had various voices saying it, it cannot be stressed enough. This is not a drill. If we do not turn back the tide of human progress in the unchecked manner, in disregard of the extent of the impacts of our actions, the generations of present would have secured the ultimate destruction for generations of the future. It was very interesting not too long ago to see a simulated dinosaur talking to a conference and telling us that if we don't change how we are behaving, then this is what's going to happen to us. 50 years ago, when states gathered in Stockholm, I personally was barely 10 with a whole uncharted path ahead of me. A young girl living on the slopes of Mount Kenya, dreams unrealized, some dreams not even dreamt, bustling with hope for years to come. My colleague Alvin was not yet born to this world. His parents had not yet met and were also forging a path for themselves in a new country, Kenya, on the heels of independence, growing out of the recent independence and the quest to get from a colonial past. There is one thing that I've noticed through the years that I remember at the time. Mount Kenya, the second highest mountain in Africa, had a full white cap. So we would say, why go to Europe when there is snow just next to us? It is always paradoxical to think of snow at the equator or around the tropical areas of the world, which are predominantly hotter than the poles. Yet, waking up to the mountain, standing tall and mighty on a morning with clear skies was truly a breathtaking experience. It still is, stunning today. 50 years on, though, a different image of the country, region, and the world exists. Many challenges and opportunities, and the idea of our interdependence with the environment, sustainability, climate change, biodiversity, pollution, environmental rule of law, all on the tongues of not only adults, but also children far and wide. Today, the Mount Kenya ice cap has drastically diminished, and underneath the ice, the jagged edges of rock tell a tale of exposure to high average temperatures over the years. The mountain actually could tell a story of climate change. And this is the story that we tell today, a global journey of environmental rule of law to address one of the three planetary crises, climate change, a journey of the world towards securing the future we want in the search for better days for generations to come. This journey, along this journey, the science is clear and has been for the past few decades. Global temperatures are rising at an unprecedented scale. In fact, at COP26, the question was, can we keep it at 1.5 or are we going up to 2? And there are actually some assessments that say it could go as high as 4. So that again becomes an issue for the lives and livelihoods of human beings around the world. And the impacts are more acute for vulnerable populations, youth, children, women, indigenous people, people living in poverty, the elderly. Historic and systemic exclusion of certain peoples in society due to various factors, including economics and politics, results in disproportionate outcomes. And the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, could not have stated it in more clear terms at the opening address of the Climate Change Conference of Parties in Glasgow. She said, the loss and damage is measured in lives and livelihoods and being lost in our communities. It is immoral, it is unjust. And that is really the heart of environmental justice. In 1972, when the first UN conference was held in Stockholm, Sweden, this was a significant milestone. And actually, Stockholm, since Stockholm to now, is 50 years. And it is also 50 years since the United Nations Environment Program was established. It was actually an outcome of the Stockholm Conference. And the key outcomes from Stockholm were principles for sound management of the environment, including a declaration and an action plan for the human environment. The question of evaluating development, not only on economic and social progress, but also on the environmental impacts of these actions, was at the heart of these discussions, paving the way for socialization of the concept of sustainable development. And I'm sure you are familiar with or can access the 26 principles of Stockholm, which charted out a landscape of international discussion on human rights and the environment. The whole question of whether we protect the environment just for the benefit of humans. And this discussion is coming back. If humans are really off kilter and they are overusing the environment, who's going to police for the environment? And I do hope that the future generation will take these up. So one of the major results of Stockholm, like I said, is the establishment of the United Nations Environment Program. which is the organization that I work for. And with a small secretariat, it served as a focal point for environmental action and coordination. Today, this secretariat is not as small as what it was envisioned. And the initial governing council for environmental programs, composed of 54 member states, is now the United Nations Environment Assembly, a body of universal membership open to all member states of the United Nations, and with broader, more encompassing contributions from countries globally. The law division that I work for in the United Nations Environment Program is the lead division charged with carrying out the functions of UNEP in the field of environmental law, governance, and related policy issues. The division's work focuses on leading the international community in the progressive development of environmental law, supporting states in the development and implementation of legal, institution, and policy measures in response to major environmental challenges, facilitating cooperation and coordination among multilateral environmental agreements and between UNEP and those agreements, working with the Multilateral Environmental Agreement Secretariat to support parties to their respective agreements in implementing their treaty obligations and facilitating policy dialogue among states on issues relating to international environmental law and governance. Through the Faith for Earth initiative, we work to inspire and empower faith organizations and their leaders to advocate for protecting the environment. Green faith-based organizations, investments and assets, and provide faith organizations with the knowledge and networks to effectively communicate with decision makers and the public. Further, we provide legal advice and guidance to the conduct of intergovernmental meetings, including the subsidiary and intersessional bodies of UNEP. I will therefore now address environmental justice and climate change from the vantage point of a key pillar of our work, environmental rule of law. Because once we become the United Nations Environment Assembly, and you will see that there's been a lull in making of environmental law. So what we are more engaged in is implementation, because the last international agreement that was concluded was the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And that, of course, is from 2013 to now, we've not had an agreement concluded. So what we are really chiefly engaged in is implementation of the laws. So environmental rule of law then and climate change. Environmental rule of law is crucial in providing solutions needed to deal with climate change. UNEP contributes to this area through the Montevideo Environmental Law Program, which is now in its 5th cycle. The 10-year state-led process started in 1982 and will conclude this current cycle in 2032, 2 years after the conclusion of the 2030 agenda. This decade of action will require concrete steps in strengthening environmental rule of law, in particular in strengthening related country-level capacity and contributing to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the further development of international environmental law. One key outcome of the Stockholm Conference in 1972, the Brundtland Report, and the 1992 Rio Conference was democratization of the concept of sustainable development. Development that seeks to meet the needs and aspirations of the present without compromising the ability to meet those of the future. This was a watershed moment of the global narrative that it is no longer business as usual. Governments, businesses, civil society, in embedding sustainability in their actions, were called on to examine the impacts of their activities on air, land, and water. Scientists' evidence of various environmental challenges in these areas demanded a global approach. For instance, with climate change, it doesn't matter where greenhouse gases are emitted. We all suffer in the same way. And in a sense, there is a justice issue because even countries that are very net minimal emitters are most affected. So basically, a global approach is called for, and promotion of multilateralism and considerations of the specific challenges and different contexts of developing countries. While environmental law in general did not begin in 1972, there being evidence of sectoral laws in some countries, the 1972 Stockholm Conference was a shot in the arm for environmental rule of law. Principle 22 of the Declaration from Stockholm contains a basis for the development of international environmental law and for liability for the actions of states, as well as a duty to compensate victims for pollution and other environmental damage caused by activities within the jurisdiction or control of such states. It has been argued that aside from paving the way for liability and compensation for pollution, this principle also allowed for expansion of the notion of liability and compensation for other environmental damage, with extraterritorial impacts, including weather and climate modification, changing the flow of ocean currents, melting the polar ice caps, to name a few. In essence, this principle laid the ground for states to be held accountable for impacts of climate change, a global phenomenon caused by and compounded by activities within one state, but with far-reaching impacts, not only within the geographical boundaries of the state, but also other states around the world. It also laid the basis for the realization that has not yet gained stronghold in international courts, but is also on track to doing so through climate litigation, which I'll speak about briefly later. States have made strides in incorporating environmental considerations in their local context, evidenced by the increases in legislating on environment, whether through standalone environmental framework laws or through sectoral environmental laws, or even through constitutional provisions. Environmental institutions such as judicial tribunals and legislative assemblies on environment have 50 years later become the norm rather than the exception. Adoption of rights-based approaches to protection of the environment, recognized as an essential aspect of environmental rule of law, has gained hold in countries around the world. Businesses are embedding what initially was considered being good civic citizens through corporate social responsibility activities. Today, we have a shift towards environmental and social governance and business and human rights through human rights and environmental policies at corporate level, becoming the norm, especially in multinational companies. However, there remains a lot to be done to cascade these efforts to ensure more widespread infusion of human rights-based approaches. And here we are talking about horizontal considerations rather than the vertical ones, which are really top-down, as well as cascading business and human rights initiatives to micro, small, and medium enterprises. Here again, vertical considerations within countries. MSMEs are the driving force in most economies, especially in developing countries, and they constitute about 90% of businesses and over 50% of employment globally. More can be done to increase uptake of sustainability reporting, which in 2015 stood at 10% for MSMEs and 90% for multinational corporations. This important aspect of business and human rights contributes to environmental justice through promoting the right to information, which encompasses principles including transparency and accountability, not only to investors, but also to people whom business impacts. In the context of climate change, Businesses at all levels and sizes should incorporate reporting on climate change impacts and human rights, including promoting such disclosure and availability of information in their supply chain. Progress to date illustrates the importance of the private sector in environmental law and government. States have a duty to implement environmental rule of law, to encourage or require businesses to adopt measures to prevent human rights abuses occasioned by climate change, and to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, including through adopting legal measures to prioritize low carbon and zero carbon investments. Taking an example from air pollution, 34 African countries, including South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, and Tanzania, have adopted regulatory or policy measures in discussions with industries at various degrees, shaping behavioral change. In Kenya, leading up to the plastic ban in 2017, various stakeholders' discussions included the Kenya Association of Manufacturers to discuss options and impacts of the ban, which was subsequently put in place through a government directive and contributed to a paradigm shift in industries, including the manufacturing industry. The role of civil society in driving change at the grassroots and national level, notwithstanding a firm internationally accepted basis to claim the rights related to the environment, is also instructive. Through reduction of consumption of single-use plastics, therefore ensuring reduction of fossil fuel byproducts, such actions contribute to addressing climate change. However, there is still more room for concerted climate action by states, businesses, civil society, individuals, and communities to drive social change to address climate change through law and governance. Specifically with respect to climate change, UNEP is committed to working with states, UN agencies, and intergovernmental organizations, civil society, businesses, and academics on various activities. For example, we provide practical guidance, tools, innovative approaches, and resources, including effective law models and approaches, as well as best practices and model indicators to countries. The UNEP Global Climate Litigation Report 2020 Status Review identified as key trends in this field, including ongoing and increasing numbers of cases relying on fundamental and human rights enshrined in international law and national constitutions to compel climate action, challenging domestic enforcement and non-enforcement of climate-related laws and policies, seeking to keep fossil fuels in the ground, claiming corporate liability and responsibility for climate harms, addressing failures to adapt and the impacts of adaptation, and advocating for greater climate disclosures and an end to corporate greenwashing on the subject of climate change and energy transition. The nexus between human rights and the environment comes into sharp focus. In 1972, the development of human rights was still at a nascent stage, yet today citizens and other rights holders are increasingly holding their governments and businesses to account based on international, regional, and national obligations. A good example from India is the case where the village representatives opposed development of a mine for bauxite in the eastern Indian state of Odisha in the Nyamgiri Hills, where after a decision by the Supreme Court of India, the Indian Ministry of Environment and Forests consulted with representatives of the Dogangaria and Kutia tribes concerning potential violations of tribal rights in the area. This decision speaks to the government's duty to regulate third parties, especially businesses, in the context of land rights, where the court upheld the range of customary forest rights for tribal peoples and traditional forest dwellers enshrined in India's Forest Rights Act of 2006, which specifies procedures for communities to protect and register their traditional forest rights. Not only does such a decision contribute to the climate change aspects through protection of forests, but also through giving impetus to rights holders to claim against international human rights law their rights for failures by businesses to take necessary action towards addressing climate change. In the future, climate litigation appears to headed towards an increase in consumer investor fraud cases, reliance on a claim concerning pre-disaster and post-disaster actions, challenges on implementation of decisions and court orders, private sector responsibilities, and an elevation from national level litigation to cases brought at international adjudicatory bodies for declarations. UNEP, in partnership with the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights and other actors, supports countries at their request and collaborates with the United Nations system to enhance the effective and inclusive promotion, protection, and respect of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, including through the implementation of relevant Human Rights Council, General Assembly, and Environment Assembly resolutions. On 8th October 2021, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing the right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is a landmark moment for the protection of environmental human rights defenders and other vulnerable populations garnering for recognition and protection of their human rights. And from a human rights perspective, it is clear now that the interdependence and interaction between human rights exists. The right to life has now a clear link to the right to a healthy environment, where climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss contribute to negative health outcomes, or directly, as is the case with environmental disasters occasioned by climate change, such as floods, hurricanes, and other catastrophes. States must be held to account for violation of the rights to life and the right to a healthy environment, among other rights. Businesses could also be held to account as well for any impact on the lives, health, and livelihoods of people. At the Glasgow Climate Conference, droves of children and youth, as well as indigenous and environmental rights defenders, clamoring for action and demanding environmental justice for climate change impacts, was a characteristic display of the resilience and brazen bravery of rights holders. Actually, many people say the most exciting thing about Glasgow was having very many young people. States recognize the need for meaningful youth participation and representation in multilateral, national, and local decision-making processes. Again, remember we said that this is so critical for intergenerational equity. And they called for involvement, active involvement of indigenous peoples and local communities in designing and implementing climate action. They also demanded full and meaningful participation of women in climate action and the need for gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, giving a voice to the key role of procedural human rights in environmental matters. Today, we must still address the question of inclusion, and I think that is one thing that will continue to be a challenge. So the centrality of environmental justice is clear in many of the multilateral fora that are being held to discuss environmental issues. And the children are opposed to rubber stamp decisions, with the rallying call being that no decision about us without us. And this, of course, also includes indigenous peoples, local communities, and other groups that have been traditionally been left behind. So I'd like to conclude and say and discuss what lies ahead. For some countries, including those in the global south, independence in the 1960s meant that there was a nascent crop of negotiators who were involved in some countries in the independence discussions And in the example of Africa, held close to their hearts the message that is still carried on today, that we can leave no one behind. Only if all are invited to the table and have a voice will there be meaningful change. And in environmental matters, environmental law and governance at the international level, all states should be involved in the true expression of multilateralism. The firm blow to environmental governance movement at the global level suffered in recent years as some states took on to nationalistic perspective, disregarding concepts such as global commons, common good, and intergenerational equity, favoring instead economic progress of the few for the benefit of today's elite. Deregulation and relaxing regulation in favor of agriculture, mining, and oil and gas deforestation is seen. Export of waste from countries with higher levels of protection to others with lower levels of legal and regulatory protection is also evident. The failure to adopt ambitious nationally determined contributions, leading to sluggishness in some quarters in the implementation of actions for global climate goals towards the 1.5-degree target. These are telling examples, and one can go on and on. But I think the stark one was also with COVID-19 and the vaccine nationalism, which was a big blow to international multilateralism. So as we continue to see political internal prosperity in disregard for the realities of the global village, then we live in 50 years on, telling the same story that was there when Stockholm was concluded 50 years ago. At the recently concluded climate change conference in Glasgow, it was heavily emphasized that while the global goal is to attain not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, we are far off track. And states reaffirmed the long-term goal to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increases, recognizing that this would significantly reduce risks and impacts of climate change. While progress has been made in climate mitigation, in Glasgow, states recognize that we are not doing enough, especially in terms of climate adaptation and finance. In the same threshold, in the same thread, states called for accelerated actions in this critical decade. We are actually less than 10 years to 2030, and it doesn't look like we're going to attain the 2030 goals. So, and there is a clear need to scale up technology, adoption of policies for energy transition to clean energy in the area of climate change, and specifically towards the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, while providing targeted support to the poorest and most vulnerable in line with national circumstances, and recognizing the need for support towards a just transition, which is really a key environmental justice issue. Developed countries will have to significantly scale up climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building for adaptation to address the needs of developing countries, including informing and implementing national adaptation plans. States called on multilateral development banks and other financial institutions and the private sector to enhance finance mobilization and urge states to explore more innovative approaches towards this end. The clear message then is that concerted action is required from all of us, from all countries, from all levels, and inclusive of all individuals and communities. Without strong environmental laws and institutions, we will not be able to protect and restore our planet, to curb climate change, to restore life to our air, lands, and water, which we depend on for survival. Environmental rule of law is essential for improving our relationship with nature. And as I said before, through the 5th Montevideo Environmental Rule of Law Program, UNEP supports governments in the development and implementation of environmental rule of law, strengthening related capacity at national level, and contributing to the environmental dimension of the 2030 agenda at the international and national levels. In promoting synergies between MEAs, UNEP provides strategic advice in harmonization between climate change, biodiversity, and pollution clusters of multilateral treaties. Through these and more avenues, there stands a fighting chance to shift the landscape on climate change. In the words of our executive director, the UNEP executive director, Inga Anderson, climate change is no longer a future problem. It is a now problem. To stand a chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we have 8 years to almost have greenhouse gas emissions, 8 years to make the plans, put in place the policies, implement them, and ultimately deliver the cuts. The clock is ticking loudly. I know after presenting such a grim reality, it's very easy for people to say, just throw their hands in the air and say, but what can we do? But here I'd like to call on an example from a Nobel laureate from Kenya, who is probably known to you, Wangari Maathai. And Wangari Maathai gave the story of a little bird that actually saw a forest burning. And it was picking water with its beak and pouring it on the forest. And somebody asked the bird, what do you think you're doing? And the bird said, I am doing all I can. And I think what we can all do is all we can. I thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, if you permit for the same, should we begin with the question answer session, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay, I have noted down the questions by the participants, ma'am. Ma'am, the first question to you by a 5th year student is that she has recently researched on a topic called danger of hazardous nuclear waste and environmental justice. After researching on the same, she has realized that how people in power are still manipulating the resources, the power, and the laws for their profit, and they're continuously ignoring the imminent threat on the environment. So, like this nuclear waste is not only imminent threat to the intra-generational equity right, but also to the intergenerational equity rights. So she wants to know the views about it, ma'am, from your point of view.
Clearly, the threats to the environment are many. And you know, with nuclear energy, there is a sense in which it has remained out of the radar of states' negotiations. But any impact that it has on the environment, anything that we do that impacts the environment today is a danger to the future generations, because they will only inherit what we bequeath.
Okay, right, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question to you is that the need of the hour is globalization. If agriculture sector and its utilization will prove as a implied climatic change, like the poverty hit communities. So how this development or globalization in the agricultural sector will improve the climatic future, and how feasible it is in the eyes of the law?
I think the agriculture is a space which many people don't look at when we are looking at climate change. Yet it is clear, for instance, that a lot of the greenhouse gases are released when we have land use change, for instance, through introduction of agriculture. And also the fact that increasingly, as people seek to get more and more produce from the land, they use more and more fertilizers, which bring pollution. So there is a growing discussion of greening the brown. And the brown is not just urban areas. I think we have to look at carrying out our agriculture in a way that does not affect the environment, especially with the runoff from the land. When we use too much fertilizer, it gets into our water bodies, and that again has other health impacts. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. A very interesting question coming up, that is, should environmental dispute be resolved through ADR mechanisms? Because ADR mechanism calls for a compromise from both the parties. But is it ethical when the environment is in question, ma'am?
Yeah, I think when there is the environment, there needs to be somebody who takes, what would you be negotiating when we are working ourselves to extinction? So there has to be a sense in which there has to be a moral high ground for the environment, because if we don't ensure that the environment is protected, we are going to work ourselves to extinction, then what would have the compromise been for? I think we have reached a stage where you can't talk of compromise for the environment. You have to talk about taking measures that change from business as usual.
Ma'am, thank you so much, ma'am. A small question from my side, ma'am. Ma'am, we being faculties, we being teachers of environmental law, even I being a teacher of environmental law, ma'am, I've taken forward this issue, ma'am. Ma'am, we ourselves are talking of eradication of poverty, ma'am, increasing employment and removing hunger, ma'am. But what kind of, like, India is still a developing country, right, ma'am? It's not a developed one. So India being a developing country, what kind of civic sense should we inculcate just for the purpose of climate change, ma'am, and environmental justice, which is very required, ma'am? So what are your views on the same? Everybody has a view, but you're working on a very extended scale, ma'am. So what kind of views you put forward for the citizens of India, ma'am? Basically, the civic sense nature.
I think India, like my country, Kenya, has progressively really taken the globalization agenda, which leads to a lot of individualization, where it is everyone for themselves, and then whoever else is not taken care of, they can take care of themselves. I think if you go to Indian culture, and you will see that there are tenets there that don't encourage the treatment of the environment in a way that is debasing. And I think at the end of the day, it has to almost be a personal change and personal decision, that it doesn't matter whether I'm being seen or not, I will stand for the environment. And that, I think, requires a law teacher may have not as much latitude to achieve this. But I think, like I said, in the words of Wangari Maathai, you do what you can, because you can't do everything, but you can do something.
Ma'am, Wangari Maathai, like, she fought for the democracy, the human rights, the environment, and the ecological conservation. She fought for it actually. She fought for the basic human rights, ma'am. Ma'am, and to end on a very warm note, ma'am, when the COVID-19 began, ma'am, the whole world was worried that the whole of the African country would be swiped away by the COVID-19. But to be very proud of, very less people know the way Africans handled COVID. There was the least amount of death in the African countries, and it might be because the God's grace of the immunity which they have got, ma'am. they really required the vaccines also, but the way the African people have fought the COVID is excellent, ma'am. And thank you so much, ma'am. The mic is over to Anushmi, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for delivering such a wonderful and enlightening session today. And I'm sure most of the participants must have gathered a lot of new information from your workshop today. And thank you for answering all the questions. Now I would request Dr. Ashish Singhal, Associate Professor, ICFI Law School, to deliver vote of thanks. Please, sir.
Thank you, Anushmi, madam, for giving me the opportunity for today's vote of thanks. Good afternoon to one and all present here. Chief guest of today's international workshop, Madam Miss Patricia Robert, Director of Law Division, United Nations Environmental Program, Brigadier Rajiv Sethi, Registrar, ICFI University, Assistant Dean ILS, Mrs. Monica Carola, faculty members, and all the students from ICFI Law School, the ICFI University Dehradun, and from other colleges of India and from abroad. I, Dr. A.K. Singhal, welcome all of you on behalf of ICFI Law School, ICFI University, Dehradun. It is such an honor for me to get the opportunity to thank you all present here on behalf of the ICFI Law School, the ICFI University, Dehradun. I extend a warm welcome to the people of gathering. I would like to express my gratitude to our honorable chief guest of today to take out time from her busy schedule to grace the international workshop on environmental justice and climate change SDG goals 2021. Thank you, ma'am, for inspiring and encouraging us with your kind words. Thanks a lot. You has given a brief about the various provisions of fundamental duties relating to the environment, and you also defined us the environmental justice with reference to the environment. You defined us the climate change. You defined us the different aspects of the world and the India and the your country Kenya. You described us relating to the national and international justice system relating to environment. A special thanks to Mr. Vishal Bera and Ms. Anushmi Jain, Faculty of Law, for immense support and organization to make the guest lecture session a great success and this international workshop. I must thank the entire team of ICFI Law School, faculty and the students for working hard to make the international workshop a great success. Thank you everyone once again for making it a great learning session. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you to all the participants. It's over to Anushmi.
So, ma'am, with your due permission, may we please end the meeting?
I can't hear you.
With your due permission, ma'am, may we please end the meeting? It was really nice seeing you here for this workshop, and we actually hope for further.
Ma'am, we look forward, yes, ma'am. We look forward to work under some research program under the UNEP and along with you, ma'am. And
Yes.
like we would further mail you regarding any research opportunity which arises from the part of the UNEP and from your end, ma'am. We as young faculties of environmental law having a Center for Environmental Law would love to work under some research program which would be initiated from your end, ma'am. Looking forward for the same.
I look forward to that too. That is my passion.
Surely, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank
With
you.
your permission, should we duly end the meeting, ma'am?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Greetings. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.